had exactly a 5-minute head start down a single dirt road. When searchers found his tricycle abandoned in the dirt, they brought in the state's best tracking dogs. The hounds bolted toward the bike, but 10 yards away, they broke. They didn't just lose the scent. They spun in frantic circles, bodies twisting against their own instincts, terrified of a specific spot on the ground. It wasn't a faded trail. It was as if a 4-year-old boy weighing 35 pounds had simply ceased to be a physical presence on this earth. These weren't untested animals. The same bloodhound team had just 1 year earlier tracked a 2-year-old girl through the New Sharon woods and brought her home alive. Their noses can detect a human scent trail up to 14 days old. They can follow a ghost through rain, through cold, through terrain that would defeat any human tracker. But at that spot, 10 yards from a campground dump in the wilderness of northern Maine, they found nothing. Or rather, they found something they couldn't process. Something that made them stop being dogs and start being frightened. Natanis Point Campground, Chain of Ponds Township, Maine. August 31st, 1975. Kurt Newton, 4 years old. Light blonde hair, blue eyes. 35 pounds of pure determination. Pedaling a red big-wheel tricycle down a dirt road through the paper company forest, trying to catch up to his father. He was last seen alive at approximately 10:30 in the morning. He has never been seen again. This case has been discussed for 50 years. But there is something in the official warden's report, something about what happened at the dump and what happened to the dogs at that specific location, that most accounts pass over in a single sentence. A detail that the lead warden supervisor, a man with 19 years of field experience in the Maine backcountry, said he had never encountered before, and never encountered again. Kurt Ronald Newton was born on July 28, 1971, in Manchester, Maine, a small town, the kind where everyone knew your name before you learned to say it yourself. His father, Ron, was a highway department supervisor, a hometown boy who had grown up racing fire trucks down the street and never left. His mother, Jill, had grown up 18 miles away in Wayne, the only girl in a one-room schoolhouse, raised above her father's general store, where neighbors stopped in not just for groceries, but for conversation. These were rooted people who knew where they belonged. Kurt was their second child, younger by 2 years than his sister Kimberly. Neighbors described him as the loveliest, sweetest towhead kid you ever saw. His mother Jill called him sweet-faced, but privately worried he was perhaps a little too attached to her. He was shy around strangers. He didn't like being away from his mother for long. And he had one particular fear, articulated with the simple, devastating clarity that only a 4-year-old can manage. His older sister Kim would try to coax him into the woods behind their house to play. Kurt would go only so far, to the edge of the backyard where the lawn met the tree line, and then he would stop. One afternoon, his mother asked him why he wouldn't go in. Kurt thought for a moment. Then he said, "Because there are monsters in there." Labor Day weekend, 1975. Ron and Jill Newton loaded the family into the car and drove north, 6 hours from Manchester, up through the spine of Maine, past Rangeley and into Franklin County, until the paved roads narrowed and the paper company forest pressed in from both sides, and the sky felt smaller somehow. They were going to Natanis Point Campground in Chain of Ponds Township, a remote cluster of 58 sites carved from the wilderness at an elevation of 1,300 feet, just 6 miles below the Canadian border at Coburn Gore. They had brought 3 other families from Manchester. There were children to play with, fish to catch from 2 cold, deep ponds, and fires to build in the September chill. It was the kind of place where, as one observer put it, you knew you were away. At night, loons wailed across the water. The forest pressed in on all sides. The mountains loomed over the ponds in the darkness like patient giants. Beautiful, isolated. The 2 words mean the same thing, depending on who you ask. The weekend was full and easy. Fishing, campfires, the cheerful chaos of 3 families sharing a small space. The weather was damp, but not unpleasant. Children ran between sites, tracking mud onto everything. Saturday night, a fisherman pulled a salmon from the little wooden bridge below the beach, and the whole campground came to watch and cheer. Kurt warmed a donut on a stick over the morning fire. He threw the paper plates into the flames. Sunday morning, August 31st, started like every morning before it. A big campfire breakfast, fried potatoes, ham and eggs, toast, juice. The kind of breakfast that sits heavy in a good way. The kind that makes the morning feel long and slow and generous. Afterward, Jill gathered the mud-soaked sneakers from the day before and walked with some of the other mothers to the bathhouse, 50 yards away, to wash them. Kim began playing a game and assumed Kurt would ride his tricycle around the campsite. Ron climbed into his Bronco, axe in hand, and drove off down the logging road to cut firewood. This is where the story hesitates. This is the moment Ron and Jill Newton have returned to in their minds 10,000 times, trying to find a different way through it. Somewhere in the camp, a friend heard a small, plaintive voice calling, "Daddy, Daddy." And then the sound of a big wheel on gravel as Kurt climbed onto his red tricycle and pedaled after his father. Just before 10:30 in the morning, 12-year-old Lou Ellen Hansen, the daughter of the campground caretaker, was walking along the dirt logging road when she heard a sound behind her. She turned. A small boy with blonde hair and blue suede sneakers was pedaling hard toward her, determined expression set on his face, going somewhere important. "Do your parents know where you are?" she asked. Kurt didn't answer. He didn't stop. He pedaled past her and up the road, and Lou Ellen watched him go, shrugged, and turned back toward the campsite. She was the last person who ever saw Kurt Newton alive. When Jill returned from the bathhouse, Kurt wasn't at the campsite. She wasn't immediately alarmed. Kurt wasn't usually far. She called his name. No answer. She called again. The forest didn't answer either. Then, and this is the moment that every parent who hears this story feels in their chest, she walked to the logging road. She looked north toward the trees. The road was empty. Not long after, the campground caretaker Jack Hansen, Lou Ellen's father, drove the logging road in his truck. He spotted something near the dump, about 8/10 of a mile from the campground. The red big-wheel tricycle sitting at the side of the road. Positioned carefully to one side, out of the way of traffic. The way a little boy who did what he was told might leave it. Hansen assumed it had been thrown away. He tossed it onto the trash heap. He didn't yet know there was a child missing. When Ron Newton returned and understood what was happening, the campground mobilized instantly. 40, then 80 Then 200 people began searching the trees around the dump site. Rangers arrived. Word spread south through Maine, the way word spreads in small states, fast and personal, traveling through phone calls and radio stations from town to town until it reached Manchester, where people who had known Ron Newton since he was a boy, racing after fire trucks, loaded into their cars and drove north. Cars from Wayne followed, full of people who remembered Jill Lovejoy from the one-room schoolhouse. By nightfall, they were pouring into the campground. That first night, a warden flew over the forest in a helicopter, his voice amplified through a loudspeaker, calling Kurt's name into the dark canopy below, telling a 4-year-old boy not to be frightened. No one knows if those words reached him. No one knows if anything reached him. The temperature dropped below freezing before morning. By first light on Labor Day, September 1st, a bloodhound team had arrived from out of state. The same team that had tracked the 2-year-old girl through the New Sharon woods the year before. The handlers scented the dogs on Kurt's pajamas, still carrying the warmth and smell of a sleeping child, and released them near the dump where the tricycle had been found. The gathered search party, nearly 200 people by now, held their breath and watched. The hounds bolted from the dump. They ran 10 yards north. Then they whirled in confusion, circling and circling the same patch of earth, noses working frantically, unable to lock onto a direction. The scent trail, clear enough to start, clear enough to produce, that initial burst of movement had simply ended. Not branched, not faded gradually the way scents fade in rain or cold. Ended. As if the boy had walked 10 yards past the tricycle and then ceased to be a physical presence on this earth. The handlers tried again and again. The dogs returned to the same spot every time, spinning their circles, unable to break free of it. One handler said the animals seemed distressed, not confused in the normal way, not simply losing a weak trail, but something closer to refusal. As if there was a wall at that point that they could not pass and could not explain. Warden Supervisor John Shaw, 19 years in the Maine wilderness, would later describe this stretch of backcountry as the roughest terrain he had ever searched in his career. But it was the dogs that stayed with him. He had never seen bloodhounds behave that way. And the detail that stopped him, the detail he kept coming back to, was simple. If Kurt had walked through that area, if he had stood there, or sat there, or even passed through, his shoes would have left prints in the wet sand and mud on the logging road. The ground was saturated from 2 days of rain. It was, as one warden noted, ideal tracking conditions. They found not a single footprint, not one. What followed became the most extensive search in the history of Maine. Over 12 days, more than 3,000 people covered 8 square miles of heavily wooded, rugged terrain. An area of blowdowns and root cavities. Rock piles covered in moss, holes in the earth big enough to swallow a man. Stands of spruce so dense the light didn't touch the ground. Not a shortcut. Not an area where search teams could fan out cleanly and sweep methodically. A landscape that seemed designed to swallow things. A C-130OH military aircraft, the same aircraft used in Vietnam to detect guerrillas hiding beneath jungle canopy, equipped with infrared technology capable of detecting a human body's heat signature through dense foliage, flew multiple missions over the forest. It found nothing. Not a heat signature. Not a trace. As if the forest had a temperature, and nothing warmer than the forest itself was moving through it. Psychics arrived from across New England, drawn by the news coverage. The lead warden, Dwayne Lewis, received them all. Later, in exhaustion, he would say, "One says east, one says north, and another tells us west or south. There's only so many points on the compass." Not one led searchers anywhere they hadn't already been. Not one led searchers anywhere at all. Jill Newton took it upon herself to search off the main routes, following a mother's instinct through the trees. Near the dump, she had noticed a large hole in the ground, the kind of natural hollow that a small child might find irresistible, a place to hide or explore. She began to dig. Men gathered around and helped her. They crawled inside the dark cavity while Jill held her breath. When they emerged, they shook their heads. Kurt wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere. No tracks, no clothing, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Nothing to suggest an animal attack. Nothing to suggest a fall. Nothing at all, except for a tricycle parked neatly at the edge of a road and a scent trail that stopped 10 yards into the trees and didn't continue. The governor of Maine, James Longley, made a personal visit to the search site. He ordered 50 National Guardsmen from the Rumford, Norway area to join the effort. After the official search ended, many returned on their own time. Ron Newton hurt his ankle in the rough terrain, but kept going, kept calling his son's name every evening as the forest darkened around him, his voice carrying into the trees without reply. Altogether, 3,000 searchers traveled 20,000 miles and spent over 2,000 hours looking for Kurt Newton. They found nothing. But the absence of physical evidence is not the only anomaly in this case. There is another detail, one that appears in the official records almost as an aside, that requires a moment of careful attention. The road beyond the dump, the road that Kurt would have had to travel if he continued north, was overgrown. Raspberry bushes, dense grass, trees blown across the path in multiple places. Experienced trackers examined it and reported no evidence of recent vehicle traffic beyond the point where Ron Newton had been cutting wood. But there was something else. Several wet, sandy sections of that road, sections where a child's footprints would have been immediately visible to any experienced observer, were checked repeatedly. There were no footprints, not one impression, not a toe, not a heel. And here is where the math becomes impossible. Kurt Newton weighed 35 pounds. He was wearing blue suede ankle shoes. The ground was saturated from rain. In those conditions, a child that size would have left prints a centimeter deep in the soft earth. There was nothing. One witness, a woman who had been camping at the site, reported seeing a white station wagon parked near the campground around the time Kurt disappeared. She said it drove away at speed, leaving a cloud of dust. No white station wagon was registered at the campground. No other witness reported seeing it. Experienced trackers found no evidence of unusual vehicle traffic on the logging road. The station wagon, like Kurt himself, left no trace behind it. And yet, like Kurt himself, someone had, apparently, seen it. Then there is this. On the night of August 31st, as the first full night of the search was underway, Jill Newton stood at the edge of the forest, and she thought she heard something. A child's voice, coming from the trees, close to where they were searching. She told the searchers. They pushed into that area. Nothing. No child. No tracks. No explanation. Now let's consider what we know and what we cannot explain, piece by piece. Kurt Newton was afraid of the woods. This was not a child who wandered into unfamiliar terrain for adventure. His sister could never convince him to cross the tree line behind their house. He had told his mother there were monsters in there. And yet, the official record indicates he pedaled 0.8 of a mile down a logging road, away from the campsite, past the dump, and then vanished. Alone, into the wilderness he feared. The rational explanation most often offered is that Kurt became disoriented in the dense forest, wandered further than anyone expected, and succumbed to exposure. Temperatures dropped below freezing the night of his disappearance. A 4-year-old in a navy blue jacket and corduroy pants would not have survived a Maine wilderness night without shelter. The problem with this theory is not the conclusion. The problem is the evidence, or rather, the complete absence of it. If Kurt had entered the forest and traveled any meaningful distance, 3,000 searchers covering 8 square miles of terrain over 12 days would have found something. A piece of clothing, a footprint, a broken branch at a child's height. They found nothing. Not one thing. The animal attack theory was taken seriously. There were black bears feeding at the open dump site, and wardens consulted with experts in other states about documented bear attacks on children. But here too, the evidence refuses to cooperate. An animal attack leaves traces. Blood, clothing, remains, disturbed ground. Searchers found none of these things. Not a drop. Not a fiber. The Natani's Point dump site and the forest beyond it were examined with the kind of thoroughness that follows from a governor's personal involvement in the largest search in state history. There was nothing to find. The abduction theory is where the case currently sits, officially classified as a non-family abduction. The white station wagon, the sudden acceleration. It fits certain facts, the absence of evidence in the woods, the scent trail that ends abruptly as if the child was picked up, the lack of footprints on the road beyond the dump. If someone pulled a vehicle over, grabbed a small boy from a tricycle, and drove away, many of these absences become explicable. But not all of them. Because if Kurt was taken from the road, from the point where the dogs lost the scent, then the tricycle should have been left at or near that point. Instead, it was found carefully to one side of the road, positioned so it wouldn't block traffic. A 4-year-old in the grip of an abductor does not park his tricycle. And the dogs. Always the dogs. 10 yards from the dump, the scent ended and the animal spun in distress. Not a gradually fading trail. Not a branch where the trail diverged. A hard stop. A point at which the physical reality of a small boy, his smell, his warmth, his 35 pounds of presence, simply ceased to register in the world. There are researchers who have documented patterns among disappearances in wilderness settings. Cases where individuals vanish from well-trafficked areas in anomalously brief time windows. Cases where tracking animals fail at specific geographic points. Cases where no physical evidence is found, despite exhaustive searches of terrain that should have yielded something. Kurt Newton's case appears in those collections, and it is not difficult to see why. The pattern fits with an unsettling precision. A child, afraid of the woods, last seen heading away from the tree line, tricycle found carefully parked, dogs failing at a hard stop, 8 square miles of terrain searched by 3,000 people, and nothing. Absolutely nothing. 50 years later, nothing. What happened in that 10-yard radius at the edge of the Natani's Point dump, in the space between where the bloodhounds ran and where they stopped, remains, by any honest accounting, without explanation. Natanis Point Campground no longer exists in its original form. The forest has reclaimed much of that ground, the way the Maine wilderness reclaims everything, slowly and without apology. The logging roads are overgrown. The 58 campsites are gone. The 2 cold ponds still sit in the wilderness of Chain of Ponds, Township, catching the light in September the same way they always have. The mountains still loom. Ron and Jill Newton continued living with the specific, particular agony of not knowing. Years after the disappearance, Ron said, "People who don't know me ask how many children I have, and I say, 2, a 10-year-old, and an 8-year-old, and I don't think about it because I will go on expecting that someday he'll walk through that door, even at 50 years old, until somebody proves to me that I'm wrong." No one has proven him wrong. No one has proven anything. In 2025, 50 years after the disappearance, the Maine State Police issued a public appeal for information. The case remains classified as a non-family abduction. A detective in the Major Crimes Unit is still formally assigned to it. Kurt Newton would be 54 years old today. There is still a DNA profile on file. There is still a phone number where you can call if you know something. The forest along the Canadian border does not keep records. It does not file reports. It does not explain itself. It was there before the Natanis Point Campground was built, and it is there now that the campground is gone, and it will be there long after everyone who searched for Kurt Newton has stopped searching. It holds whatever it holds with complete indifference. The ponds are cold and deep. The mountains don't speak. And somewhere, on a logging road in the paper company forest of northern Maine, 10 yards north of a campground dump, at a precise point where train tracking, animals lost all ability to sense a 4-year-old boy. Something happened. Something that left no footprints, no scent, no trace. Something that 3,000 people over 12 days, military aircraft, bloodhounds, and 50 years of investigation have not been able to name. The wilderness doesn't owe us an answer. It never has. But sometimes, in the particular silence of a Maine autumn morning, when the mist sits heavy over the ponds and the forest presses in on all sides and the mountains loom over everything like patient, ancient witnesses, you find yourself thinking about a 4-year-old boy on a red tricycle, pedaling hard, going somewhere important, calling for his father, disappearing into a question that has never been answered. The dogs stopped 10 yards from the dump. They have never started again. Kurt's trail evaporated into thin air, erasing itself so completely it overwhelmed the senses of animals trained to find the unfindable. But what happens when a trail doesn't just stop? What happens when it actively fights back? When the dogs don't simply lose the scent and spin in confusion, but break formation entirely, turning on each other, howling at nothing, refusing to move for hours. In our next case, search dogs didn't just fail. They short-circuited. And nobody who was there that day has ever been able to explain what caused it.